Right, thank you everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yep, good. Apologies, I'm using like two laptops here, so it might go a little bit haywire, but I'm going to go with it. So, title of my presentation today, Distracted Driving, the Law and Why We Need It, really is a kind of an amalgam of two topics, really. It reflects on some research I've recently been doing for Gloucester Police through a Home Office Star Fund application that we're doing on various things to do with digital technology and driving safely. The other part of it is basically the legal side of it, because that's what I was asked, if I could also do a little bit of law while we're at it. So, a bit of a hybrid one, but I think what kind of brings it all together, really, is the sense in which whether the law can actually do anything or not, or whether we kind of need to give that up to a certain extent and kind of focus on the kind of more social science elements to it and getting the message across, rather than relying just on the law to kind of solve the problem. That's what's supposed to tie it together. We'll see by the end whether it does or it doesn't. Right, bear with me because I've got two things to do here now. Right, so just a quick background. I had no idea at what kind of stage I would be in the presentation and what had gone before me. So I've just put some basic stats up. These aren't my stats, I should argue. These are just kind of the official stats to kind of look at mobile phone use, mobile phones and driving. So you can see there's a reduction in the percentage contribution to total police punishment, I've called that. So that's fixed penalty notices paid. What else have we got? Court proceedings, driver retraining. In overall terms, so of those 19,700 that were issued in the latest year, about 6 of those resulted in driver training. I think it's about a third resulted in court action, and a half were fixed penalty notices paid. So you can see the kind of substantial reduction. What's driving that reduction? I can't give you an answer to that one today. I can make some guesstimates, shall we say. One of those will be the decision in the Barretto decision that I'm going to look at in a bit. That kind of not substantially changed the law, but interpreted it in a way that made enforcement that little bit more difficult. So we've got what might appear to be some kind of retreat, if you like, or retrenchment, and move backwards from enforcing this kind of legislation. Nevertheless, we've got evidence from the DFT in their survey they do, I think it's every year, of 1% of drivers were observed using their mobile phone in their hand. That's not hands-free. The hands-free figure will probably be much bigger. The majority of which were caught using their phone to the ear. That's probably quite standard, to be honest with you, because of the state of the technology, although there is technology that can find it in your laps now. And what they tend to find is that there are drops in usage after legislation, but like all things, it regresses to the mean and it goes back again. So the fact that we might see a drop in the next year or two because of this the new regulation that's come out, the new regulation 110, doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be anything significant at the moment. You need a much longer period to do it over. In terms of attitudes then, again, it's not my research, this is just Hill, just kind of putting all this up for context. 27% in Hill study, I think this is through the DFT actually, had held a mobile phone while driving. Over half had used a mobile phone hands-free. The acceptability of doing so is really context dependent. I think that's kind of pretty well known now. It links in with what was said in the first presentation this morning. And that when your car is stationary, about a fifth of people found it acceptable. And when family calls were made, about a sixth of people acceptable. So it's more acceptable stationary than it is when your family calls you, which is interesting. But there we go. So what I want to talk about anyway is my project that I've been dealing with. Well, not my project, but a project I've been involved in called Digital Drivers. There were various strands to it, 4 strands in all. It had the acronym KIWI. Not entirely sure why, but my strand was the knowledge strand. The other ones were intelligence, well-being, and insights. I think we just liked the acronym. I think that's what it was, really. So in the Knowledge Act then, what we wanted to do was basically look at, it's been referenced quite a lot today, this idea of what we call optimism bias, or the sense in which you think you're a better driver than the average driver. And, Kelso Breeze, everyone thinks they're better than the average driver in most things. So what we wanted to do was basically test whether we could affect that, to change that optimism levels by basically involving people in a knowledge test of sorts. So this was a test run through an app called RoadHow, who originally, when we wanted to do the project, we were thinking we could link it in with telematics data as well, but unfortunately, because of the timings, we didn't have the capacity to do that. So we just basically based it on knowledge instead. And so we took a random sample of people aged 18 to 24 and 70 plus. Those were the people that we were interested in. It was the study was set in Gloucester. Those were the areas of interest that Gloucester Police had. So that's what we focused on. And what I did was develop a kind of 10-point Likert scale I wanted 10 because, I don't know, 5, the 3 in a 5, just, I don't really know what it means necessarily. Whereas 5, I mean, we can argue till the cows come home, you know, should it be 5, 7, 10, whatever it might mean. But 10 just appealed to me, so that's why I went with it. So we did a 10-point Likert scale across 13 questions that studied optimism bias, and then 12 that studied driving anxiety as well, to see if we could make any difference. And what we wanted, ideally, was to see optimism go down, and potentially anxiety to increase a little, so that people become a little bit more aware, spatially aware, and are just a little bit more aware of their driving. So this is, this is the problem of having two computers. These are the statistics we got back of the pre-study. So we did a test pre and post. So basically, complete this survey, complete these scales, then do these 100 questions over a 3-month period. Come back and please, you know, do the follow-up study. We lost quite a lot of people, it's fair to say, in the follow-up study, but I think that's pretty much standard anyway. So overall, I think we had about 150 people take part in the first part, do the questions, and then by the end we had about 40 left, which is, you know, it's all right. It's not brilliant, but it's all right. It gives us enough for what we're talking about. So you can see here across the statistics, so an average driver is 5, essentially. If you consider yourself an average driver, you're 5 across all these skills. The higher you go up, the better you are to where you're 10 and you're the perfect driver. There were quite a few that did put 10 across all major questions that we, in fact, across all questions that we asked, they did put 10. 10s across that and 1s across anxiety, so there were some very highly rated drivers out there, you know. We didn't have anyone from Formula 1, but it sounded like we did. And we can see the means there. So the means are all above average, with the exception of the 1 at the bottom. Let me just go through. I've got some fancy graphics that don't really help much, but there we go. So avoiding an accident when using a mobile phone hands held. They weren't very confident in their driving, basically, that they would be able to avoid that accident. So that's quite positive in that they did not rate themselves as, I mean, it's only just below the average driver. Let's not get carried away. But they are below the average driver when they're using their phone hands held. That's what they feel anyway. As regards hands-free, much higher, feel much more confident and safer using their mobile phone hands-free. Ignoring their phone, which is a positive one really, is they were very confident that they could ignore their phone while they were driving. I very much doubt that, but there we go. You know, I can't argue with the statistics. One interesting one that did stand out for me was this one that should flash now. Hey, there we go. Is that they felt they were a better driver having consumed 1 pint of lager than they were if they were using a mobile phone, which I think does say something interesting about a captive audience for spreading a message of enforcement against handheld mobile phone. Hands-free, that message isn't there, but for handheld, I think it is, in that there's not a captive audience, there's a receptive audience, I suppose I should say. The audience would be quite pleased with crackdowns on mobile phone handheld use. I think that's what those statistics suggest to us. So optimism across the ages then. So the young were slightly more optimistic than the old. I mean, kind of, it's not surprising to me, to be honest with you. You know, we're talking about mobile phone use, no disrespect to anyone who's in the 70-plus group. But let's face it, you're probably going to be slightly more tech-savvy in the 18 to 24 group. So you're more optimistic about your skill because you can use that phone quite a lot easier. Sorry. So anxiety then, driving anxiety, again, 12 points anxiety test. Again, across 10, a 10-point Likert scale. So 1's not anxious, 5's moderately anxious, and 5 is very anxious. What we can see from this is basically they weren't very anxious drivers at all. When it comes to mobile phone use, in fact, I don't think any anxiety score was above 5. So they were all generally not very anxious, if truth be told. Sorry, just bear with me a second. Right, so the big question then. Did RoadHow, oh no, I've given the answer away. I shouldn't have done that. It's hidden on my computer, but not on this one. Did RoadHow have any impact on optimism scores? The answer is a big fat no, pretty much. Unfortunately, for most things, no, it didn't. I mean, for most things related to mobile phones, no, it didn't. So no statistically significant difference in optimism as regards using a mobile phone hands-free. None in terms of ignoring your mobile phone. So it didn't make you more likely to ignore your phone. It didn't make you more likely to suggest that you were more optimistic about using your hands-free mobile. However, again, going back to the same point I made on the last slide, is there was a significantly different statistic in terms of optimism. Yes, we've got a result. In terms of handheld phone, again, so it was minus 2.74 optimism score. So it's a moderately successful reduction, shall we say, in optimism as relates to using your mobile phone handheld. So, again, oops, sorry, bear with me. We do see some reflection that using or administering knowledge tests can reduce your optimism about your driving when you're using your mobile phone handheld. So that's very good, potentially good news for UK Roed if they were holding courses on handheld mobile phone use, hands-free. The jury's still out on that, I think. Okay. Right, next one. So did RoadHow test impact phone anxiety scores? No, made no difference whatsoever. They weren't less anxious or more anxious. There was a slight increase, but again, it wasn't statistically significant. So again, not really much to report on the anxiety scale. Right, one thing we did post-study, which was actually a suggestion from Helen and Gemma, was if we could ask about mobile phone use. What would happen if you're driving along using your mobile phone in your hand and you got caught by the police? What would you do? Would you switch to hands-free use in future, be so embarrassed that you'd never use a mobile phone again, or hide it better was the other option? And basically, what they say is 2/3 say basically that they would stop using their mobile phone altogether in the car. I don't think that's true. I think that's an absolute fib. And it's what we see quite regularly when it comes to one of the things that kind of ties this all together in terms of law and human research or social research, is that people are motivated to do these things, but their practice in no way bears any relation to their motivations. You can get people who are very motivated to comply with the law. Doesn't matter, they're still going to break the law. Because of ignorance might be one thing in what's required, or they just don't relate their situation to this idea that it's against the law. So there was only one person. I've had a look today where we've got a few more surveys in, so for the latest data, and there's still only one person that said that they would hide it better next time so that they don't get caught. Interestingly, 10s across the board. They thought they were the best driver ever. That probably explains why they thought, well, I can hide it anyway because I'm such a good driver. So what can we conclude then about this? In general, basically, there's above average bunch of drivers. It's unlikely that that's the case. In reality, they're just exhibiting what everyone else exhibits, which is optimism bias. They're not a very anxious bunch, again, potentially the case. Or the drivers are quite unrealistic in their expectations of safe driving, which I think is probably truer or nearer the mark. So as regards the mobile phones then, there's a clear message, I think, that handheld or regulations that target handheld use is successful, that people do respect that law. Well, respect it might be going too far, but do recognise it as a very legitimate use of the law against people. Probably against other people, but that's for another day. So, yeah. Right, so now onto the law. This is where it gets a bit, slight change of direction. But I think it's necessary, really, just to kind of bring this kind of social kind of finding into how it relates to the law, really. So what I'm going to look at is the mobile phone, the changing mobile phone laws, basically, from the old Regulation 110 under the Construction and Use Regulations, which basically, regulated handheld use, plus a device which performs an interactive communication function by transmitting and receiving data. That was the issue. That's the issue that led to the court case of DPP and, I'm going to go with Barretto. I'm not entirely sure how you pronounce it, Barretto or Burrito. I'll let you choose. Barretto. So in Barretto, as we'll see in a minute, there was a dispute over whether using your mobile phone as a camera was using a device which performs an interactive communicative function by transmitting and receiving data. Essentially, he said, well, I'm just recording, I'm not transmitting or receiving any data. And the Court of Appeal agreed with him. So under the new legislation, though, or the new regulation, basically the focus now is on handheld use. That's it, really. It's on handheld use and on devices which are capable of transmitting and receiving data, and this is the key point, whether or not those capabilities are enabled. So that it doesn't matter whether you have them or they're working at the time, which was the old regulation. Now it doesn't matter. So the key point is no longer has to be performing the action so long as it's capable of doing so. My question would be, at what point? So we can all think of devices. I've got a phone that I can put on the flight mode so it doesn't fly, so it doesn't, sorry, what am I about? Misspoke there. So that it doesn't receive any data. That would fall within the regulation, that's quite straightforwardly. But what about, say, like an iPad that has no function, no SIM card, no data? Does that fall within the regulation? Because at some point it could transmit data, because you can hook it, if you know how to do it, you can hook it up to your phone, which will then transmit with your phone and transmit on further on. So I think, I mean, to be honest with you, the whole tenor of this regulation is let's be commonsensical about it, and it definitely does fall within the regulation, I think. But one issue that we're going to look at in a moment, got a bit of a highlight in there going on. So this was the impetus, should we say, for change. Director of Public Prosecution Ramsey Barretto, I've just got over the facts, basically drove past an accident with his mobile phone up. Pretty much, you know, for want of a better word, he copped to it, to the police officer, then went to see a solicitor, and the solicitor said, I don't think they've got a case here. Stepped forward to High Court, and they agreed with him. They didn't have a case because of this, what it says here. So had to be for the purposes specified in Regulation 110 as a mobile phone or interactive communication device, which it was in this point, that the use of the non-communication functions does not bring the device within the definition of the paragraph 1B. And lo and behold, the government changed the legislation. Pretty much, I mean, the writing was already on the cards anyway, I think, but this gives it that kind of added impetus that something needed to change. Because there are all sorts of situations you can imagine where you would use your mobile phone that isn't necessarily transmitting data, and led to all sorts of potential loopholes, if you like. So what's happened then is basically it removes the problem of use and instead focuses on handheld. Handheld is now the key determinant. Is it handheld? You still have to use it for certain purposes, although that list is now non-exhaustive. But it really does move to handheld. Although I should say as well, I have to put this in every time I talk about Barretto, is that basically the court were very clear that really what should have happened in this case was careless driving. Careless or inconsiderate driving. And it was almost undoubtedly the defendant would have been convicted, but he wasn't charged with that offence, so that was the problem. So the new regulation then, use, much expanded definition, all of these things, it's non-exhaustive, so to the extent that a phone can do something different in the future, I can't think of anything, but then I'm not that tech savvy, but if it does something new in future, it's almost likely to fall within it, because it is non-exhaustive because it says the word includes. So illuminating the screen, checking the time, notifications, unlocking, calls via the internet, sending, receiving, uploading content, videos, camera, drafting, accessing document stores, etc. It's pretty much all covered. Anything you can do with your phone is now covered, okay, when it's handheld. So handheld is the key focus of the regulation. There are some situations, as I note there, where you can use your phone handheld, so remote control parking function, or to pay for something, like a toll road or some such. If you pay with your phone there, you're entitled to use your phone handheld, but they're the only situations. So that got me thinking, it's probably not an original thought, but the smartwatch. The smartwatch now can pretty much do everything that your phone can do. It might not be as good when you're using it or satisfying, but it can pretty much do everything you can do. So what I want to do is basically run through the new regulation to see whether it fits within that offence. So there are three questions really, if you're preparing a case note or you're preparing a PACE interview or some such. These are the kind of three areas that you would need to prove, really. The first thing is the driver on a road? In the majority of cases, that's non-controversial. There might be some kind of issues if they're on a petrol forecourt or on a car park, for instance. So this has to be on a road. It's not in a public place. Okay, so that's the first hurdle. But again, shouldn't cause too many problems. Is it a device for the purposes of 110 to 13 of 1986 regs? Well, yes, if it's capable of transmitting and receiving data, whether or not those capabilities are enabled. And as a result of case law, whose name escapes me at the moment, pretty much that is for want of a better word, it's a commonsensical decision, really. I think it was the High Court that said, and I can't remember for the life of me the case, sorry, I will find it if anyone wants to know, that you can use your common sense. As an officer, you can use your common sense. An officer knows what a mobile phone is. He doesn't have to actually evidence that it is a phone and capable of doing all these things. Okay? So, is it a device? Again, relatively straightforward, should pose no problems. Is the driver using the device handheld? So the smartwatch, so far, we're golden. We're on for a prosecution. Is it handheld? This is where the problem arises. Okay? So using it obviously falls within the regulations. Even just to check the time, you know, that simple flick that we all do now, we're all kind of used to see, it's like, oh, what's going on there? It's flicking the wrist. Just to check the time, that falls within the regulation. The problem is that handheld? And this is where the issue arises. A mobile telephone or device to be treated as handheld if it is or must at some point while being used. Now, I don't really know what that means. And because I don't know what that means, there will be other lawyers looking at this thinking, I don't know what that means either. Let's give that a challenge. Let's fly in somewhere. So, I mean, obviously, with a smartwatch, it has to be held at some point. You can't magically get it on your wrist without holding it. But putting it on your wrist is not use under the regulations. Checking the time is. But necessarily, in order to have a look at your watch, you need to use your hand. But you're not holding it, or are you, though? Because you are using your wrist. So when does handheld become wrist-held? And I'm honestly not sure. I consulted the oracle of all things common sense, my wife, about this. She felt it did fall within the regulations. She's not a lawyer. I felt it doesn't. So who knows is the answer to that one. Until it's tested in court in some way, no one really knows. But that's in the wrong place. That should be slightly lower. So checking the time, checking notifications, and unlocking the device. You were going to do all that all the time when you're using your mobile phone. Sorry, your smartwatch. So what are your options then? If it doesn't fall within the regulations, there are three. One of them I've missed off. So driving without due care and attention, careless driving, in section 3, or driving without consideration for other road users. Just bear with me. And driving without proper attention is the key thing, but never mind. Are the three kind of offences. These two in particular, as Helen said at the start, require something more. It's not the fact of you using the device that's the problem. So with careless driving, you know, it's below the standard of expected of a competent and careful driver, but just the fact you've got your phone in your hand or your watch on your wrist is not enough. There has to be, it's a focus on driving rather than the actual state of the driver. Driving without consideration, that case there just merely states that basically consideration is a factual issue and it's not for anyone other than magistrates to determine. But notice though, if you do want to go with those regulations, they are wider. So if you do catch someone doing something that they shouldn't on a petrol forecourt, then section 3 is your go-to offence, because that would be a public place, although it wouldn't necessarily be a road. So if you want to go there. So what does that all mean then? Why do I raise these particular issues in a way? Well, I think the key thing to take across from all of this is that the law on distraction here focuses on handheld mobile phone use only. It's a very specific law for a very specific activity. It is not a distracted driving law. It might fall within the kind of penumbra of distracted driving law, and there's numbers that can fall within that, and they all have their different peculiarities, shall we say. But what we know so far as regards distractions that are related to kind of mobile phone use, unless it's actually a mobile phone and it's handheld, then it's not regulated under that regulation, I should say. So again, the law isn't really focused on distraction as such. It's focused on very specific distractions in very specific situations, I think is what I would say. So other distractions you can deal with under that. I think that's everything I've got to say, really. I did have any questions, but obviously we're doing that later, so, well, thank you. Okay.